I do a lot of brush work, and my levels is probably too complex, as I mentioned in the previous video, and it causes a lot of issues when I'm trying to compile maps, right? Like these bullshit edict limits or limits for different specific entities. Like, dude, there's even a brush limit in Source, and yeah, there's different engine versions, their version of the editor or custom hammers, hammer editors that have the different limits, but they'll usually raise them instead of just getting rid of them. There was a comment I made to somebody a little while ago talking about this, where I said, it's some weird holdover of, I mean, probably most games have this, but you know, if it's not more obvious with Quake derivative engines, it's at least more salient to me because I have more experience with them. But one of the worst games for it is Soldier of Fortune 1, which is on Quake 2 engine. That game is weird because there's no real sort of Impulse 101 or give all cheat. Soldier of Fortune 2 has a give all cheat, Half-Life 2 has Impulse 101. There's nothing really like that. You have to spawn the separate weapons or ammo boxes. Well, but the problem is those count as edicts. And it's you can crash the game spawning ammo even if you had the space in your inventory to collect it, because it doesn't matter to the engine. It's just the fact that you went one over the edict limit, and so now it crashes to the console. The game is still open, but it disconnects you from the server. That's actually something a lot of people, it blows their mind that a lot of these single player games are technically just a local server. But yeah, it's a pretty intrinsic to at least Quake derivative engines. But if you're playing Soldier of Fortune 1 and you want to crash the game real fast, just make a bind to spawn the ammo boxes, and you can crash the game almost instantly. Just spam the option, especially if they're just dropping on the ground because you can't pick them up. But because my mapping can be so intricate, I'll hit limitations that probably most don't end up hitting, right? So for an example, the overlay limit. I hit that on Left 4 Dead 1, try to switch to CSGO, and then it wouldn't compile either because I put too many fucking, overlays for its limit. And then I was going to try a custom VBSP, but it just wasn't fucking working for whatever reason. I was like, holy fuck. Why even, just don't put it there, right? But a lot of the stuff I do will necessitate these kind of workarounds, and it's what I'll end up doing a lot. It's having too many funk detail isn't necessarily going to end up working out. But you also, there's with brush entities like funk brush, there's a limit. But sometimes I make brushwork that is so intricate and kind of either is self-intersecting, because not doing that would just essentially be impossible, or the faces touching each other would cause the engine to split it in such a way to essentially fuck up how it looks and create holes in the geometry. So I might have this decorative thing that maybe part of it is funk detail and another part of it is funk brush, just so they don't kind of split each other's faces up. Because a lot of times, it's even if the engine will split the faces, and now you've got more triangles, but that's not necessarily the same thing as having more actual face IDs in the engine. But the main problem is that if you have funk detail and funk brushes kind of working together, you'll end up having to no draw stuff that you probably wouldn't otherwise, because otherwise it'll render that face. So despite what a lot of people believe with Radiant era stuff, you don't actually have to calc or null or no draw or whatever the fuck every face that you won't immediately see on an object. most of those get removed in compile time. So for an example, if you put a funk detail sort of trim on a wall that's solid, CSG, yeah, like what's behind that funk detail thing won't be visible, but that texture will still be rendered. Now, if it had all been solid geometry or all been a funk detail, that part of it would have been removed. But sometimes you can have this trap where people know to make most stuff funk detail, but as a result, they end up not no drawing a lot of stuff that they should have no drawn. But you have to be cognizant of that. So, like for an example, because I had mentioned the elevator guy, Romanian elevator guy, and I had like I always wish in those videos they would show the staircases more, like walk around a little bit more. A lot of times they just get in the elevator, ride it up, ride it back down, and then it's done. But one of the staircases in one of his videos was particularly compelling. So I made a similar looking staircase. That's that one I mentioned where at the same time I decided I wanted to make a painkiller style map. And I haven't fucked with it since I made the staircase, but so I was originally going to try to do some stuff with that. But another thing I'll do, which I did for the staircase in that map, was something that you're really not recommended to do, which is creating geometry that's smaller than the grid size. Like having it placed in such a way that it's not aligned to the grid's already, an issue with Source Engine. But having them, having brushes smaller than a unit, uh, to any degree can cause problems. But I'll still do it anyway. So, like for an example, I made this one handrail where the balusters were all only like a half a unit. But the way that I did that was I created them 1 unit wide. I used the scale tool, like Control M, I think it is, not the vertex one that's Alt E, but just a regular brush scaler one that's a Control M or whatever the fuck. And I scaled it on the X and Y, by 0.5. So now it was half a unit square. And then I put a skip brush or whatever around it that was 1 unit wide, so that when I tried to move it, it wouldn't snap it out of position. It would stay centered within the 1 unit area correctly. And I just duplicated that for the whole handrail. But because it was angled downward, the brush for the baluster and like something I mentioned in the other video, I forgot the name of this part. The part that's near your, or actually I did mention this part, I think. The part that sort of is like near the bottom of it, kind of near your feet area, right? That'll run horizontally. What the fuck is that part called? Those two parts were separate brushes that were angled downward to, follow downward on the staircase. But I just took the balusters and just, translated them, downward to just match it or whatever. And so now not only do I have subunit geometry, I also have intersecting geometry. And yeah, so those parts that intersect, chances are like that would be something where it's like some of some parts of that, like the balusters and the newels, I would probably make a funk detail, and then the banister and the area lower down would probably be funk brush or some bullshit like that. But as far as the microgeometry stuff, I'll do a lot of shit with that. Like I'll do this hyper detailed geometry, and what I'll do is I'll make it like whatever scale I want, I'll multiply it, if that makes sense. So if I want detail on the order of a quarter unit, then when I first make the stuff, I'll make it at 4 times scale. Once it's built out the way I want it, then I'll use the the brush scale tool with the texture scaling lock enabled to shrink it back down to a quarter size, so that's the correct scale. And I've got brushwork at a quarter unit resolution or whatever. and do some really, really intricate stuff, like, the designs on like wrought iron gates, or like, you know, the grading on manhole covers, or the little differences between, pieces of like a sidewalk or whatever. But then the problem, of course, is a lot of times I'll save the map, and something that Source will do, or Hammer will do, maybe Worldcraft and Gold Source does it as well. But whenever you save a map, it won't necessarily complain about stuff, but the engine, or the editor, considers it invalid, and the next time you open the map, it'll, like, fix it for you. And that can piss me off sometimes. I've spent literal hours before making ultra, you know, ultra complex, intricate brushwork for some particular thing. Save the map out, reopen it. Now my shit's just not there anymore because, the engine knows better than me. And it's like, holy fuck, could you have at least given me an opportunity to export the geometry? Because, like, I used to do that a lot. Export as like a DWF or whatever the fuck they call it. Import it into 3ds Max, clean it up, and like re-export it as a model. I've also, 3D design, Painkiller, like I mentioned in one of the last videos, something that drew me to 3ds Max and stuff like that was how the level design of Painkiller was done. Because according to them, I'm pretty sure they said they used 3ds Max, or maybe it was Maya or something, but they actually created the geometry in a 3D design program, computed the radiosity lighting in the program, and then, it was just, baked into the textures of the models in the final game. And it fascinated me because, Source Engine couldn't put light maps on models. Hypothetically, it can now, but as far as I've read, certain versions that supposedly support this, they're really referring to the vertex lighting stuff, which is not the same thing. Vertex lit generic is not light mapping, but it was Painkiller that heavily inspired me to like look more into 3D design. But if you've ever fucked with 3ds Max before, you notice you can basically do stuff sort of like Hammer or some other type editor like that. And the way that I would do it is using UV mapping, and that allows you to place the textures pretty much how you would do it in Hammer editor. And because I don't really give a fuck about performance or anything like that, I just do stuff to look cool. What I would do is I would do an auto unwrap of the UVs and, bake the texture off of that. I didn't care if it wasn't packed effectively because, all I cared about is that it would basically take all the textures I had UV mapped with and bake it all into the final texture. And I would just auto unwrap and then, just render out a fucking 2K or 4K texture. I don't care if it runs like shit, But, I've done lots of different stuff like that. And what I thought was interesting when I mentioned that article I'd read about Painkiller's development in one of the last videos, this is something like I'd read it in the past. It was like from 10 years ago or whatever. But when I reread it, because I was looking for some stuff related to Painkiller, but I didn't find what I was looking for. But something the article said, I'd read it before, but I forgot it said this, that, yeah, like originally Painkiller was supposed to use essentially Quake 3 engine. They said it was called something else, but even they said it was like suspiciously like Quake 3. It was probably some Eastern European reverse engineered Quake 3 engine. But what's cool is, like, if you look at the levels that they created really, really early on in Painkiller's development, dude, it looks like Daikatana. And it, like, if you're aware of how Painkiller could have looked when it came out, you would be like, are you fucking serious? It was just so vastly different looking. Funny enough, the later games that weren't made by People Can Fly, but either way, they're actually kind of more like the original concept design of Painkiller, and they're way less popular games, which is kind of proof that what we ended up with was the best possible scenario. But yeah, I don't know. I don't really know where else to go with this. I'm almost at 15 minutes and whatever. I'm basically done with this video, but I've just always been fascinated with, architectural design, level design, CSG brushwork, 3D modeling, texture mapping, all that other type of shit.